All right, welcome to day 2 of the Geologic Record. We left off somewhere around here yesterday. I'm going to cover a couple of things over again, but we talked a little bit about these dinosaur fossils and how, these fossils are found in the Geologic Record. So again, this chapter and the previous one go hand in hand. That's why we do them one after the other. But when we find these dinosaur fossils, oftentimes they are remarkably preserved. This right here is a plesiosaur. You can see even the little flipper bones are intact. That's only something that can happen if this creature was covered extremely fast and fossilized extremely fast. Not just the sedimentation process, but the mineralization process also has to be happening really, really quickly. And just to give you an idea of how quickly this needs to occur, anybody in here know their dinosaurs enough to know what type of fish dinosaur this is?
No.
What was that? Nope. This is an ichthyosaur. So we don't have these around anymore, but they were swimming around back in the day. And when we look at this creature, you can see it's very remarkably preserved. You can see the snout pretty good. The flippers are certainly well intact. So is its tail. And then there's this thing right here. Anybody want to venture a guess as to what that is?
Is that another dinosaur?
It is another dinosaur. That's actually another dinosaur that's coming out of this one. This ichthyosaur was fossilized in the process of giving birth. So again, this process of fossilization has to happen extremely fast. Could you imagine being stuck in labor for 100 million years while you're waiting to turn into a fossil? And then down here, these are also tiny little fish. They're swimming in a school, and they were fossilized while still swimming in formation. Again, this is no millions of years process, folks. This must occur quickly. So how does this occur? And we're going to spend a good amount of time just talking about this here. So if you can just imagine as this flood is occurring, like I mentioned last time, it's not one of those things where you would just see this rain and this water slowly build up and get higher and higher. That's not how that would work. There are lots and lots of different forces at work on our Earth. And one of the forces, the Coriolis force, has the effect of causing tides to go out and come back in. So you get 2 high tides and 2 low tides over a 24-hour period. And so as the waters were building up in Noah's flood, you would at least have, these waters coming in and going out at least that many times in a day. Again, 2 high tides, 2 low tides in the span of 24 hours. That's probably what laid down a lot of the rock record here. And this is just a quick example. So you've got these dinosaurs, they found high ground, so they're happy for at least a little while. And then maybe high tide comes in, and that water is going to cover up this little hadrosaur along with the eggs that she laid. And you have then a layer of sediment here. These guys are able to survive a bit longer. They're a little bit bigger, more intelligent probably, and they're able to survive at least that onslaught of water there. So you have this layer laid down, and over time, because of the saturation of that water, and after all, eventually, even the highest mountains would be covered, that would give you the perfect scenario for this mineralization process to happen. Because this isn't dry sediment. It's sediment that's just saturated with this mineralized water. It would cause this fossilization to occur very, very quickly. And in addition to all of this, where did all this water come from? Well, the Bible tells us that, the windows of heaven were opened, and it says that the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So you've got 2 sources where all this water would have come from. Whether the rains came from the sky supernaturally or naturally, if God used a mechanism that he had in place on earth to make this occur, the Bible doesn't say for sure, so we can't say for sure. But we do know that this water was coming from both of those locations. And a lot of times people wonder, well, where did all this water go, right? How come we're not still covered by all this water? Well, during the flood, you did not just have, and we're going to get into this more later. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but this water would have run into the newly created ocean basins. Those created ocean basins then would have been very dense, and again, we're going to get into this later, but because they would be very dense, they would sink, and then you would have mountain ranges arising, and that water simply ran off the continents into the new ocean basins. So where did all that water go? Went into the oceans. Another thing, a lot of times people don't realize that if you leveled off all of the earth, you have enough water to cover the entire earth to a depth of, I think it's either 1.6 miles or 1.6 kilometers. But there's a lot of water on the earth. So it all went into the oceans. Now, it's not just fossilization that can happen quickly. Go ahead and write down the title and then the bottom bullet point. Yes, you're still under that first strand from Lyell's philosophy.
So the title and which bullet point?
Title and the last bullet point. The title and the last bullet point. Pointer size paper?
Printer.
Oh,
Like
that's
that.
8.5 by 11.
8.5 by 11.
And just in case you are curious to look more into this process of how Noah's flood would have laid down these different layers, I'm going to go back to the previous slide just for a second here. This model is known today as the beds model, briefly exposed diluvial sediments. And if you want to read more about that, feel free to check that out online. Creation.com is a great place to do that. But it's not just fossilization in sediments that can occur quickly. Lyell believed that petrification is something that required millions upon millions of years to occur. So he liked to highlight a lot of instances of petrification in the world. So again, the idea is if we see all this stuff that's petrified, it must be millions of years old. But now we know that that is not necessary. So you can see up here, this is a petrified hat, and this is a petrified teddy bear. These are not from millions of years ago. And actually, if you have something that you want to turn to stone in just a few months, you can take it to this location. This is North Yorkshire in England there, and the city is Knaresborough. They have a special waterfall there, and you can. The waterfall has so many minerals in it. The mineral content is so high that if you just hang something in that waterfall over a couple months, it's going to petrify and turn to stone. So once again, this is not something that requires millions of years to occur. From this slide right here, write down the title and the last bullet point. So again, other things that supposedly take millions, and in the case of diamonds, billions of years supposedly to form, we can actually make these in just a couple of days. Opals, which are pretty neat little colored rocks there, Australian guy can create them in just about a month. And, it was normally thought that they need hundreds of thousands of years to form on their own. And a company in New York can actually make a diamond for you in 4 days. And it's not just that company. Almost any diamond store today, they can actually make a diamond for you instead of discovering it in the ground. It's a lot more expensive than a typical diamond, but it is the exact same. When I was looking for wedding rings for my wife, one of the diamond places that I went into, yeah, go ahead, they had a sign that advertised these types of diamonds. And the sign said that the only difference between these diamonds and the ones that you find in the ground is that the ones you find in the ground take billions of years to occur. In terms of their molecular structure, it's the exact same. In terms of how they look, it's the exact same. So again, I'm not saying that when these diamonds were created, that they were made in the earth in 4 days. All this is showing is that these vast amounts of time are not necessary. Again, write down the title and the last bullet point, please.
Look at the pattern.
Yes. Now we're dealing with stalactites and stalagmites, and how many people have been to a cave where you've seen these things in person? Anybody? Okay, it's kind of a neat experience. So the idea is you've got mineral-rich water that leaks from the top of the cave to the bottom, and because that water has minerals in it, when it drips, some of those minerals are left on the top, and then some of them get deposited on the ground. And as they continue to accumulate, you have these stalactites and stalagmites forming. So even though they're supposedly occurring over these hundreds of thousands or millions of years, in these caves where now people have handrails and people have put chairs and they've left garbage down there, you commonly see these things forming on those. They're seen forming on handrails. You start seeing these little stalactites and stalagmites forming on those. And chairs and pop cans, really anything that you leave down there, that mineralization process can occur extremely fast. Bless you. From this one, write down the title, and guess which bullet point? The bottom one. Very good. Yes. So again, it's the same story for coal. The story on how coal forms is something that we're going to get into a little bit more later. But the idea is that it takes millions and millions of years for this vegetation to accumulate and compress and then turn into coal. When in reality, you can actually make coal yourself in a very short period of time, in just 1 to 9 months. Vast amounts of time are not required. And again, this is all under the first thing that Lyell was trying to point out in his book, trying to emphasize these geological features that seem to demand long periods of time to form. Well, they don't need long periods of time to form. We see that again and again and again and again in the real world. So you can probably guess where we're going next here. You might want to rewrite this bullet point again before you start the second one, just so that you know what it is that you're talking about here. But yeah, bullet point, what's underlined, and then that's kind of the heading for the next group of notes we're going to be starting here. So again, the other thing behind this philosophy of uniformitarianism is the idea that, again, the present is the key to the past. In other words, you have to believe that all geological features can be explained by the slow and gradual processes that we see happening in front of us right now, regardless of any catastrophes that might have happened. Even if that's completely unlikely. So we're going to take a look at some of these geological features here. And we were talking briefly about coal in the previous slide. So a little bit about how coal supposedly forms. If you've ever read up on how coal supposedly occurs, it almost always includes this story of a swamp. So the reason that they have to have a swamp there is because that's the only way they can imagine lots of vegetation accumulating in one place. Because usually when we look at vegetation, it disintegrates and it just kind of is absorbed into the environment that it's in, like in a rainforest or other places. For this to work, the swamp has to be just above sea level, to have to cover the whole area, which is hundreds of miles across, and sink gradually over hundreds of thousands of years at exactly the same rate that the vegetation was accumulating. So in other words, you have to have these swamps that are just hundreds of miles across. They're at the exact same elevation with respect to the water table over that period of time. And as the vegetation, the dead vegetation, is accumulating, you have to have that level remain stable as well. So you have to have this all happening over those huge, huge periods of time, millions and millions of years, and then it has to be covered by other sediments so that the pressure can then turn that vegetation into coal. That's quite a story that you have to believe there, and it doesn't add up in a lot of different ways. For instance, when we find these coal seams, we do not find soil under them. Why do you suppose you'd need to have soil underneath a coal seam if it got here by vegetation that's been growing? Madison?
So the vegetation can grow.
Exactly. You need soil for that vegetation to actually grow. But we don't find that. Usually we find it oftentimes exactly in between just rocks or silt. We do not find soil above or below these layers of coal, and we should. Geologists won't say the vegetation washed into place because that would require an enormous flood, which again is far too catastrophic for the uniformitarian way of thinking. They don't allow these big catastrophes, certainly not one big enough that could wash all that vegetation into place, even though that's a better explanation for why we see what we see. You can't get vegetation growing out of a rock or growing out of silt or clay. Write this whole slide down, please. These are fun. So all we have to look at are the observations. And whether you are somebody who believes in naturalism and uniformitarianism, or whether you're somebody who believes the biblical version of history, we all have the exact same data. We're all observing the exact same things in this world. And what we really have to ask ourselves is, which is the better explanation? The uniformitarian way of looking at things or the biblical way of looking at things? And like in the previous example, when we see this coal, it had to have been put there somehow, either, through a swamp or being washed into place. And when we look at a straightforward interpretation of the evidence, that points very strongly in the direction of Noah's flood having ripped up all that vegetation and washing it into place in the same way that it did the fossil record. And the same thing is true here. What's a better way to explain these fossilized trees that pass through lots and lots of different layers here? Because these layers are sometimes separated supposedly by tens of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years. Well, the tree isn't going to just stay there while those layers build up around it. It would have long since rotted away. A much more easy way to explain these observations is simply by saying these trees were washed into place by Noah's flood, and these sediments were laid down very quickly one after another as that water washed into place and then receded, and then washed back onto the continents and then receded as a result of the tides and maybe other things. The reason actually this goes a little bit deeper. I'm not going to have you write anymore, but it's sort of interesting when we look at these polystrate fossils, because these trees, why would they be vertical? Because again, oftentimes we don't find soil underneath these trees in the same way that we don't find soil underneath coal seams, even though it should be there. But how would they turn vertical? Well, one of the ways that we have observed this in modern times is from the Mount St. Helens eruption that occurred in 1980. So if you've seen that eruption, how many people have seen videos of the Mount St. Helens eruption? Anybody? just a couple people. So it was one of those eruptions where instead of, the volcano exploding up high into the sky, it was more like a, ugh, it just kind of went out over the edge. And the result of that was Mount St. Helens was right next to a lake called Spirit Lake. So a lot of that pyroclastic flow went into Spirit Lake. It displaced all that water. The water went up the surrounding mountain, and it ripped up a whole bunch of trees and vegetation from that mountain, and it carried it all back down into Spirit Lake. So for a while, that lake was just covered all the way across with this ripped up vegetation. Well, guess what happened after a while? The roots of those trees that were ripped up absorbed that water, because that's what tree roots do. They absorb water. And so when they absorb that water, they get heavy and they sink. And the trees would sink vertically like this in the sediment that was put down there at the bottom of that lake as a result of the bark and other organic material that came off of that vegetation. And we see this happening right before our very eyes as a result of a catastrophic flood. And so that's probably how these polystrate fossils occurred during Noah's flood. And it's neat how God allows us to open our eyes and see these things happening right in front of us. These sedimentary blankets on the continents, you don't need to write any of this down, but one major prediction of Noah's flood would be that the rapidly rising muddy water would leave behind vast extents of mostly flat layers across large continental areas. Again, eventually, every continent was covered. So sometimes you'd have these floods going across an entire continent, an entire landmass. And so as they're laying down these layers, we'd expect them to go across that huge area. And guess what? That's exactly what we find. Whether you're looking at the Grand Canyon out in the western part of our country, or you're looking at the geologic record and the different layers that are exposed in the eastern part of the country, we see the exact same ones. Folks, if these layers were laid down from local floods at these individual locations, you should not have layers extending across entire continents. But that's exactly what we see time and time and time again. Not just here, but also in places like Australia. So if you ever find yourself at Grand Canyon, or you're going to be going there for a field trip, or you're just taking a family trip there or something, if you go to creation.com and you type in Geology Transformation Tool, this thing is going to pop up. And basically what it is, science is not just something that's reserved for the secular world. Lots and lots of Bible-believing Christians are doing wonderful science in the area of geology. And what they've been doing recently is they've been trying to figure out, we all see these rock layers. They're trying to figure out at what point, the layers indicate the floodwaters were rising, which layers were laid down as the floodwaters were increasing, which ones were laid down as the floodwaters were receding, and what were laid down after Noah's flood. And so, instead of just looking at the plaques that you'll see at Grand Canyon or the brochures that will tell you, that the Devonian rock layer is 400 some million years old, if you have this little transformation tool with you, you could see that it was just a layer that was laid down during Noah's flood as those floodwaters were rising. There's lots and lots of really good creation science going on all around us today. So check this out if you're going to be heading there sometime. Sort of gives these layers a little bit more meaning. We see very flat gaps between these layers. Again, if these layers were laid down and then there was 100 million years and then the next layer was laid down and then there's 100 million years, then there's the next layer, you should not see flat layers. The flat layers that you see carved out of the Grand Canyon are not what we ought to expect, because you would have tens of millions or hundreds of millions of years of erosion that should be taking place over that period of time. Folks, how often do we hear about fires and floods and tornadoes and hurricanes and sometimes even volcanoes ripping up the old and carving new landscapes? These layers should be anything other than flat if they're really being laid down every 100 million years or every 10 million years. And yet when we see these layers, they look extraordinarily flat, which is exactly what we would expect to see if they were laid down very quickly before this erosion could happen as a result of Noah's flood. A couple other little pieces of evidence that we find here. Quartz boulders have been found in the areas in yellow here, and yet we know that they have their origination in this red area. So how could these extremely heavy boulders get to those locations? Well, it's kind of interesting because they show evidence of having been carried along in a massive flood. They have indentations, circular indentations, that indicate violent collisions while being transported by deep water flows, which could have been maybe a gigantic river. But of course, the scientific community can't say this because that sounds a little bit too much like the biblical flood. Remember, they want to stay away from these big catastrophes, even when they make the explanation actually make some sort of sense. But yeah. And so what this kind of means then is, this is where the Rocky Mountains come through. So what probably happened as Noah's flood was receding into the ocean basins off to the west and off to the east, this was probably the dividing line where those waters went to the west and to the east. So it carried those quartz boulders, some of them in this direction, some of them in that direction. It's really the only way they could get so far from their original location. Next two quotes come from secular scientists here, and the thing is, just like with the fossil record, just like with genetics and DNA, just like with origin of life, just like everything else we've talked about, they're starting to realize that naturalism, and in this case uniformitarianism, is not a good way to explain even basic observations that we see. Lyell also sold geology some snake oil. He convinced geologists that all past processes acted at essentially their current rates. This extreme gradualism has led to numerous unfortunate consequences, including the rejection of sudden or catastrophic events in the face of positive evidence for them, for no reason other than they were not gradual. And we see this not just in geology, but in other areas of science as well. Instead of the naturalistic worldview encouraging science, instead of biblical history hindering science, we see the exact opposite. When you start with the assumption that there is no God, that naturalism is true, that uniformitarianism is true, it holds back good science. We have allowed ourselves to be brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme and what might be termed catastrophic processes. It is time to stop being brainwashed. Not only do we need to reject uniformitarianism, we also need to look at the geological evidence free of million-year-old shackles. When we do, we find the evidence is best explained by biblical history, which Lyell also worked so hard to dismiss. The evidence we find is what we would expect from the Bible's account of the global catastrophic flood of Noah's day. And that is the second of the three strands that we've been looking at here. With the time we have left, probably want to write that bullet point again, and you'll want to write down this underlined one here. And this will be a good place to pick up our story next time.